In the sun-bleached silence of a dying afternoon, a lone figure stood between the wind and the town's last hope. Heat shimmered off the dirt street, blurring the edges of the world, and the stillness felt like the moment before a match was struck. The outlaws thought they'd cornered an old man with nothing left to lose. What they didn't know was that he could shoot the coin from a crow's beak before the bird even flapped away. The settlement lay in the lap of a basin between the jagged red canyons and the pale sweep of the desert plains. Its wooden buildings leaned as though wearied by years of wind and grit, and the air smelled of dry sage and sun-baked timber. The horizon was sharp, a cut of deep orange rock against the washed-out blue above. It was the kind of place you could ride past without ever knowing it had been there, a handful of lives clinging to the earth like stubborn weeds. The sky felt heavy that day, the light flat and brittle. Somewhere far off, a hawk circled slow, its cry lost to the restless wind. That same wind carried something else, a faint murmur that seemed to tremble through the air, a warning if a man knew how to listen. And one man did. Dust began to rise on the far side of the plain, a twisting, rolling column that grew taller with each heartbeat. It wasn't the wind raising it. It was horses, several, moving fast. The sound reached the town a moment later, the low, thunderous drum of hooves striking hardpan. By the time shapes emerged from the heat shimmer, every set of eyes in town was watching. They came like a storm front, men blackened with trail dust, scarves pulled up over their mouths, eyes hidden under the brims of sun-scorched hats, rifles and shotguns slung low, revolvers riding their hips. The leader rode a tall, dark horse, his frame broad, his posture loose but dangerous, like a big cat that hadn't decided whether to pounce or play. He scanned the street with the slow certainty of a man who already owned it. People vanished into doorways. A mother snatched her child from the steps of the mercantile, disappearing inside before the gang passed. The few men who stayed in sight leaned against walls with their hands tucked in their belts, their eyes flat and cautious. The only one who didn't move was the hunter. He stood where he had been, leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, a slouch hat shading his eyes. His shirt was the color of dust, sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing arms as lean and sinewed as old rope. In one hand, he held a fresh-killed rabbit by the hind legs, the other hand idly turning it so the light flashed along the barrel of a skinning knife. The gang slowed as they reached him. The leader's gaze settled on the man like a weight. "You deaf, old-timer?" he said, voice smooth as river stone but edged with mockery. "Town's shutting up for business." The hunter's eyes lifted under the brim, calm and unreadable. "Ain't my business what other folks do," he said. The words came slow, as though he was measuring them before letting them out. The leader smirked, but didn't press. He nudged his horse on, the gang following. They dismounted in the street, tying their mounts to rails, kicking up grit as they spread out. Some moved toward the saloon, others toward the general store. Their voices carried, sharp, demanding, the kind of tone that made the hair on the back of your neck bristle. Inside the saloon, the batwing door swung open and shut, spilling the sour smell of whiskey and the quiet shuffle of boots on sawdust. The outlaw leader pushed through, his men fanning out behind him. Conversation died. The piano player froze mid-key. The hunter stepped in after them, not hurried, not hesitant. He moved like a man used to watching from the edges, but every step was measured. He set the rabbit on the bar, the knife beside it, and leaned his rifle against the wall. The barkeep glanced at it nervously, as if expecting trouble the moment that weapon left his reach. The outlaws began making demands: food, drink, supplies from the store, whatever coin the townsfolk had on them. The barkeep poured whiskey with a shaking hand, the bottle clinking against the glass. One outlaw, a wiry man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, swept coins from the till into his hat. Another shoved a ranch hand off his stool and drank from his unfinished mug. The hunter said nothing. He watched. His gaze tracked every movement, every shift in weight, the subtle twitches in trigger fingers. His expression didn't change, but his eyes were alive, sharp, predatory, the way a hawk watches a rabbit's heartbeat from above. Clay Maddox, the leader, turned from the bar and faced the room. "We're looking for something," he announced. Word is, a payroll shipment came through here a few days ago. Never reached its destination. We're thinking maybe it got mislaid." No one spoke. Maddox smiled without warmth. "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way. The easy way is you tell us where it is. The hard way you won't like." The hunter's fingers drummed once against the bar. Maddox noticed. "You got something to say, old-timer?" The hunter shrugged. "Just thinking it's a long ride to come all this way for nothing." His tone was mild, but the words had an edge under them. The room seemed to hold its breath. Maddox tilted his head, studying him. Then he grinned as though amused. "You one of those talk-slow types? Or just stupid?" The hunter's lips twitched at the corner, the barest ghost of a smile. "Could be I just like to see a man prove he's as bad as he claims." That earned a low chuckle from one or two of the gang, though they smothered it quick when Maddox's gaze cut their way. Maddox stepped closer, until he stood a hand's breadth from the hunter. His shadow fell across the man's boots. "Careful," he said. "Rattlesnakes get stepped on in places like this." The hunter met his gaze, without blinking. "Then it's the snake's fault for being where it don't belong." For a heartbeat, the two men stood locked in silent challenge. Then Maddox turned away with a short laugh, as if the matter were beneath him. But the set of his shoulders had changed, and the easy looseness in his stance had tightened. The hunter reached for the rabbit again, slipping it into a small burlap sack. The knife vanished into his belt, hidden by the fall of his shirt. His rifle stayed against the wall, but his glance toward it was quick, almost casual. If you weren't watching for it, you'd miss it entirely. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutters and carrying the scent of oncoming rain, though the sky still blazed with sunlight. The town had gone still again, waiting to see how the day would turn. The hunter walked toward the saloon doors, moving past the men who had surrounded him minutes earlier. None of them stepped in his way. His boots crunched softly on the dust as he stepped outside, and for a moment the street was empty except for him and the drifting grit in the air. He leaned against the hitching post once more, as though he had never moved at all, one hand resting near the butt of his holstered revolver. His eyes tracked the reflections in the windows, the shifting shadows on the ground. Every flicker of movement was marked, measured, stored away. If any of the outlaws had been watching closely, they might have noticed how his hand never quite left that revolver, or how his gaze shifted not to the men, but to the empty spaces between them, the angles where a bullet would pass clean and sure. Clay Maddox had the kind of smile a man wore right before striking a match and tossing it into a barn full of dry hay. It wasn't warm or welcoming. It was a thin curl of the lips that promised trouble, and his eyes made good on that promise. Cold, pale, and sharp as cut glass. They didn't just look at you. They took your measure, found your weakness, and filed it away for later. Stories of Maddox drifted across the frontier like smoke. Banks emptied in broad daylight. Ranch houses burned with the doors barred. Lawmen buried in shallow graves marked only by the boots sticking out of the dirt. He sat his horse in the middle of the street, one gloved hand resting on the reins, the other on the butt of his revolver. The gang fanned out in a slow, practiced arc, their boots sending little puffs of dust into the heat. "Round 'em up," Maddox said, his voice calm, almost conversational, but with the weight of a man who expected to be obeyed without question. The command set the gang in motion. Two men pushed through the saloon doors, their shoulders brushing the swinging panels aside. A third took up position at the corner of the building, rifle raised, scanning the street. A fourth man strode toward the store, waving his gun at the few stragglers who hadn't yet run for cover. One by one, the townsfolk were herded toward the saloon until the place swelled with tense, sweating bodies. The hunter was among them, still leaning near the doorframe when one of the outlaws, a lanky, sunburned man with tobacco stains on his teeth, jerked his chin at him. "Gun. Now." The hunter's gaze slid to the man, then to the rifle leaning against the wall where he'd left it. His hand rested there for a fraction longer than necessary before he picked it up. He turned it over once, inspecting the worn stock, the polished trigger guard. Then, without hurry, he leaned it gently against the bar. The outlaw snorted as if he'd expected some kind of protest. What he got instead was a nod and the faintest smile. That smile unsettled the youngest member of Maddox's crew, a wiry kid whose eyes were too wide and whose hands trembled when they touched the grip of his revolver. He kept glancing at the hunter like he couldn't quite square the man's calm with the situation. Maddox pushed through the crowd, every step deliberate. "Afternoon, folks," he said, his voice carrying easily over the creak of floorboards and the shallow breathing in the room. "Now, I don't mean to overstay my welcome, but I'm here on business. I hear there's a little something that came through here. A payroll shipment. Problem is, it didn't make it to where it was headed. I figure that means it's here. Somewhere." His eyes moved across the faces before him, resting briefly on each one, as though he might see the truth flicker in someone's expression. No one spoke. A woman near the back tightened her grip on her child's hand, pulling him closer. An older man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Maddox's grin returned, slow and mean. "Now we can do this the friendly way, where you just point me to it, or the unfriendly way, where I find it myself, and leave you folks wishing you'd been more hospitable." Still no one answered. The silence was thick enough to feel. Maddox's eyes drifted to the hunter. You've been out in them hills, haven't you? Maybe you've seen something." The hunter's head tilted slightly. "Seen plenty. Rabbits. Coyotes. Dust. Payroll." Maddox asked. The hunter shrugged, the gesture loose and easy. "Don't reckon I've seen one of those running wild." A few in the crowd dared to glance up at the exchange, sensing a current under the words. Maddox's gaze hardened. "You're a smart man, I can tell. But smart can turn to stupid fast if you forget who you're talking to." The hunter's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but as though he were measuring the space between them, mapping the man's stance, the way his hand sat on the revolver's grip. For a moment, the years rolled back in his mind, and the saloon's dim light was replaced by the blaze of a battlefield at dusk. He remembered the smell of gunpowder clinging to the air, the cries of men echoing across broken ground, the cold certainty of aiming at someone who was aiming back. He had faced worse than Maddox. Men faster, meaner, more desperate. Men who didn't live to see the next morning. "I know who I'm talking to," the hunter said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Question is, do you?" The words landed like the click of a cocked hammer. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly swallowed by the weight of the moment. Maddox took a step closer until the toes of their boots were nearly touching. "You looking to find out?" Maddox asked, his tone no longer light. The hunter's gaze didn't waver. Not yet. For a long second, neither man moved. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick and heavy. Then Maddox straightened, taking a slow step back. His smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes this time. "Keep your place, old man. I'd hate to see you make a mistake." He turned his attention back to the crowd, barking orders for his men to search the buildings, turn over every crate, every sack of grain. The younger outlaw still kept glancing toward the hunter, his expression caught between curiosity and dread. The hunter eased back against the wall, folding his arms loosely across his chest. Outwardly, he looked as still as the carved post beside him. Inwardly, his mind was turning, tracking every movement in the room, every man's position, every route to the door and the street beyond. Maddox thought he'd taken the man's teeth by taking his rifle. He didn't realize the hunter's deadliest weapon wasn't steel or powder, it was patience. And patience was something Maddox didn't have. They came for him at first light, the horizon still painted in the bruised colors of dawn. Maddox's voice was the first sound in the quiet, flat, cold, and leaving no room for argument. "You know the land," he said. "You're leading us." The hunter stood in the middle of the street with the dust of sleep still in his hair, the cool morning air tugging at the edges of his coat. His eyes flicked to the others, men tightening cinches on their saddles, checking the loads on their rifles. The townsfolk watched from windows, silent and pale. He didn't argue. He simply swung into the saddle of a wiry bay mare and set off toward the canyons, without a word. By the time they reached the first rise, the sun had broken free of the horizon, spilling long, golden light over the land. The canyons rose ahead like the jaws of some ancient beast, jagged cliffs of red rock stacked high against the sky, their shadows long and deep. The air was dry enough to crack a man's lips, and every breath tasted faintly of dust and stone. Hawks circled high overhead, their cries sharp against the emptiness. They rode in single file along a narrow wash, hooves crunching over gravel and dry sage stems. The walls of the canyon rose on either side, closing in like a noose. Maddox stayed close behind the hunter, silent except for the occasional click of his tongue to his horse. His men muttered now and then, their voices low, glancing up at the cliffs as if expecting trouble to come rolling down. The hunter moved at an unhurried pace, pausing now and again to kneel and study the ground, tracing lines in the dirt with his fingers. He'd nod once, as though confirming something only he could see, then point toward a turn or a fork. The trail he chose wound him deeper into the canyonlands, into places where the sun barely reached until midday, and where echoes played tricks on a man's ears. He led them along the lip of a dry riverbed littered with the pale bones of long-dead cattle. The air here was cooler, shadow pooling beneath overhangs. He stopped at one point, crouched, and brushed away a thin layer of dust to reveal a faint boot print. "Couple days old," he said. "Could be your payroll passed through here." Maddox studied the print, then glanced at him. "Could be." The hunter shrugged. "Hard to say. Desert keeps its secrets." What Maddox didn't see was the truth, that the print was his own, left the day before on a solitary walk. He was weaving them into a maze, every step taking them farther from the real trail and deeper into ground he knew better than his own hand. Now and again, a sharp turn in the trail would pull the hunter back into another time. The wind in the canyon became the whistling shriek of shells overhead, the cries of hawks replaced by the shouts of men in uniform. He'd been younger then, skin sunburned under the brim of a cavalry hat, a long rifle resting easy in his grip. They'd called him Crow-Eye, for the way he could spot movement at a mile and make the shot before the other man even knew he'd been seen. Entire enemy detachments had been led astray by his false trails, their supply trains vanishing into dry gulches and dead ends. It was a deadly art, and one he hadn't forgotten. The sun climbed higher, baking the air until it shimmered against the stone. Sweat rolled down faces, dust clung to beards, and tempers began to fray. A man named Coulter spat into the dirt and muttered something about walking in circles. The youngest outlaw, still pale under the tan, kept glancing back the way they'd come. "Shut your mouth," Maddox said without turning. "We'll get there when we get there." But his own eyes had narrowed, and he had started to watch the hunter a little too closely. They stopped briefly in a patch of shade beneath a rock overhang, the horses lathered and blowing. The hunter crouched nearby, turning over a flat stone to reveal a nest of scorpions, which scuttled away into cracks. He tucked that away in his mind. When the others weren't looking, he shifted a few loose stones near the trail, a small, harmless act now, but in the right moment, it could send a horse tumbling. The march continued, deeper into a part of the canyons, where even the wind seemed to move carefully. The hunter began to slow their progress under the guise of scouting. At one point, he led them over a narrow pass where the rock underfoot was slick with loose shale. He walked sure-footed, his boots knowing every step, but behind him the outlaws stumbled and cursed, their mounts slipping dangerously close to the edge. Now and then he'd pause to point out a mark on the canyon wall. Might be a sign of wagons passing through. Maddox would nod, though his jaw worked like a man grinding his teeth. The men had begun to spread out less, the canyon pressing them tighter together. The heat gnawed at them, made worse by the scarcity of water. The hunter led them past a dry pool where the earth was cracked into plates. He said nothing of the spring he knew lay a quarter-mile behind them, hidden in a fold of stone. That was for later, if he decided they should live to see it. As they moved, he began the quiet work of laying snares. A small tripwire stretched across a bend in the trail, low enough to be missed by a man on horseback. A few carefully loosened rocks on an overhead ledge, ready to tumble if nudged. None of it screamed danger now, but they were seeds he was planting for when the time came. The canyon shifted as the sun slid lower, shadows creeping up the walls like rising water. The air cooled slightly, but the men's tempers did not. Maddox's second-in-command, a squat man with a scarred cheek, rode up alongside the hunter. "Where the hell are you taking us?" he asked, his voice low and hard. "Where the trail goes," the hunter said without looking at him. The man grunted, but the hunter heard the doubt in it. Doubt was a crack, and cracks could be widened. By the time they made camp, the walls of the canyon were painted in bands of crimson and gold, the light fading fast. Maddox gave orders to post guards and keep the fire low. The hunter sat apart, his back to a boulder, watching the flames lick at the thin sticks they'd gathered. In the shadows beyond the firelight, the traps waited. In the hunter's mind, the map of the canyon was clear. 100 ways to vanish, 12 ways to kill, all of them laid out in the same still, patient order that had won him battles years ago. Maddox thought he had a guide. What he had was a man leading him into a place where every turn, every stone, every breath of wind belonged to someone else. And the hunter intended to keep it that way until the noose he'd been tying around them all day was ready to pull tight. The fire burned low, its orange glow licking at the darkness, throwing restless shadows across the ring of worn faces. The desert air was cool now, but the heat of the day lingered in the dust, seeping from the rocks like an exhalation. The hunter sat apart, his wrists loose against his knees, eyes half-lidded but always watchful. Every flicker of movement, every sound, boots shifting, tin cups clinking, Maddox's low growl of conversation, slid into the quiet ledger he kept in his mind. He studied them without hurry. Maddox, the self-appointed king of this ragged band, lounged near the fire like a lion on a kill, yet his gaze moved constantly, weighing every man, guarding his place. The rest showed there were in different ways, scarred knuckles rubbing idly at knife handles, hungry eyes glancing toward the meager strips of jerky, shoulders stiffening when Maddox's attention landed. But it was the youngest who caught the hunter's focus, a boy, barely grown, with hands that trembled when they reached for the coffee pot. His eyes were too bright, his jaw too tight, and his laughter, when it came, rang hollow. Later, when the others drifted into their bedrolls, the boy lingered near the edge of camp, staring into the dark as if afraid it might stare back. The hunter rose without a sound, stepping over dry ground as easily as if he were crossing a carpet. He came to stand beside him, saying nothing at first. Silence often loosened more tongues than questions. "You're not scared of Maddox," the boy said at last, his voice pitched low. The hunter let the words hang between them, eyes on the faint ribbon of the Milky Way above. "Fear's a choice," he said, quiet but certain. "It can keep you alive, or it can put you in the ground." The boy swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He'll kill anyone who crosses him. I've seen it. You're not the first he's brought out here. And you follow him anyway." It wasn't an accusation, just a truth laid bare. The boy's voice cracked. "A man's gotta eat. And if you're not with Maddox, you're against him." The hunter's gaze shifted to him then, steady as stone. "There's more ways to survive than picking the winning side. You just have to live long enough to see the right moment." He let the meaning settle in the boy's mind, then turned away, as if their talk had been nothing more than a passing comment about the weather. The camp quieted to the breathing of sleeping men and the occasional snort from the tethered horses. The hunter waited, letting the night deepen, letting the stars slide across the sky. Patience was as much a weapon as any rifle, and he'd learned long ago that the kill was easier when the prey thought they were safe. When the time came, he moved like water over stone, no sound, no wasted motion. The guard posted near the horses stood with his back half-turned, arms folded, head dipping in fatigue. The hunter's knife slid from its sheath, the blade catching only a whisper of moonlight. One step, two, a breath held, and the knife found its home beneath the man's ribs. A muffled grunt, a shudder, and the body sagged silently into the hunter's arms before touching the earth. He retrieved his rifle from where it had been stowed near Maddox's gear, the familiar weight settling into his hands like an old friend. The wood was worn smooth, the steel cold and certain. With it came a quiet promise. The days of walking in Maddox's shadow were done. He worked quickly, slipping through the darkness between bedrolls, always keeping to the edges where shadows pooled. The horses shifted uneasily as he approached, catching the scent of a predator in their midst. A murmured sound, a hand brushing against a flank, and they stilled. One by one, he worked the knots loose, easing the ropes from their ties. A nudge here, a soft slap there, and the first of them began to drift into the dark, hooves muffled in the sand. The rest followed like water spilling downhill, until the camp was left with nothing but empty tethers swaying in the breeze. Somewhere behind him, a man stirred, muttered, and turned over. The hunter froze, his breath shallow, then melted back into the dark. By the time Maddox's eyes snapped open, some instinct tugging him from sleep, the hunter was already gone from the firelight, watching from the black mouth of the desert. Maddox's head turned, sharp and searching, taking in the missing guard, the loosened ropes, the faint sound of horses vanishing into the night. The outlaw leader rose, his silhouette framed by the dying fire. His voice was low, dangerous. "He's not just a tracker," he said to no one in particular, but his men stirred at the tone. "He's playing us." In the shadows, the hunter watched the realization flicker in Maddox's eyes. It wasn't fear, at least, not yet, but it was the first step. Maddox knew now that the man he thought he could bend had teeth, and this hunt was no longer his to control. "Would you like me to also build the final showdown section, so this western arc ends with a high-impact conclusion?" The first crack of the rifle split the morning air like a blade. Sunlight had barely begun spilling over the jagged rims of the canyon, but already the echoes rolled and twisted between the stone walls. A man dropped without a sound, his body folding in on itself before his partner could even turn his head. The scent of gunpowder mingled with the dry tang of dust, drifting on the still air like a warning. Somewhere high among the rocks, unseen, the hunter adjusted his rifle, the scope glinting once before the light swallowed it. Panic spread through Maddox's gang like wildfire. The men scattered, some dropping to their bellies in the sand, others bolting for the nearest patch of cover. Their shouts ricocheted off the cliffs, but every echo seemed to mock them, turning their own voices into a chorus of fear. They didn't know where he was. They didn't know how many there were. And that was the hunter's gift, making the lone man sound like an army. A second shot came from nowhere, and another man spun sideways into the dirt, his rifle clattering away into a dry gulch. The cry of a hawk answered overhead, distant and sharp, and for a heartbeat, the gang froze. Then chaos erupted again. Maddox barked orders, his voice raw and desperate, trying to regain control. Two men sprinted toward the canyon wall, hoping to circle around and flush the shooter from above. But the hunter knew this land the way a wolf knows its hunting grounds. He was already moving, slipping between boulders, feet silent on the grit. The morning sun flared against his cheek for a moment before he ducked into shadow, melting into the folds of the rock. Every step was chosen, every angle anticipated. By the time the flanking pair reached their vantage point, they were stepping directly into his sights. The crack of the rifle was deafening at this range. One man fell instantly, the other stumbled back, clutching his side until a second shot took him down for good. Maddox's second-in-command, Burke, saw it all from below. His face twisted into a snarl, rage blotting out caution. He shouted Maddox's name once before breaking cover, rifle in hand, charging up the slope in a reckless bid to end it. The hunter let him come, watching him close the distance. Burke reached the plateau and fired wildly, the bullets snapping against the rock. Then the hunter was gone from his perch, appearing instead to Burke's right, low and fast, the rifle already slung behind him. They met in a violent collision, Burke swinging the butt of his rifle, the hunter catching it mid-arc. The blow jarred through his forearms, but he twisted with it, ripping the weapon from Burke's grip. Burke lunged, tackling him against the canyon wall. Dust rained down. They grappled, boots grinding into the sand, the hunter's movements economical and deliberate against Burke's brute force. A sharp knee to the gut doubled Burke over, but he came back with a wild haymaker that glanced off the hunter's jaw. Pain flashed hot, but the hunter didn't falter. They crashed to the ground, each man fighting for leverage. Burke's hands went for the hunter's throat, but in a swift, cold motion, the hunter shifted his weight, trapping Burke's arm and rolling him into a choke hold. Burke thrashed, curses breaking into ragged gasps. The hunter's grip tightened, not with fury but with finality. Moments later, Burke lay still, the dust settling around his motionless form. The hunter rose, breathing steady, eyes already scanning the canyon for the next threat. Below, Maddox was alone. The others had either fled into the maze of rocks or lay still in the sand. The outlaw leader's breath came in short bursts, sweat streaking the dirt on his face. He clutched his revolver tight, his gaze darting from shadow to shadow, knowing that every step he took was being measured, every movement anticipated. He could feel it now, that cold, calculating patience stalking him from the cliffs. Somewhere in the shifting haze of heat and stone, a legend began to form in Maddox's mind. The whispers of the man's past, half heard in saloons and soldiers' camps, suddenly rang true. Stories of a ghost-like figure during the war, a scout who could vanish in open ground, a marksman whose bullets found their mark from impossible distances. The name had never been spoken above a whisper, but now Maddox knew. The next shot didn't come right away. It waited, stretching the silence into a taut wire. Maddox spun at the scrape of gravel, but it was nothing, only the wind. His hand trembled on the revolver. He called out into the canyon, his voice bouncing back at him, smaller than before. Another moment passed, then another. He began to think maybe the man was gone. Maybe he'd slipped away. A single shot rang out. Maddox's hat spun off his head. A neat hole punched clean through the crown. He froze, heart hammering. The message was clear. Asterisk, I can take you anytime I want. Asterisk. High above, the hunter lowered his rifle, eyes locked on the man below. The game wasn't over yet, but the balance had shifted. Now, it was Maddox's fear that would lead him through the canyon's deadly embrace. The echoes would carry the story long after the bodies cooled. The canyon was still, the morning light spilling over its jagged ridges in pale gold, dust drifting lazily on the breeze. Maddox stood in the open, a revolver pressed hard against the temple of the youngest outlaw, his arm clamped around the boy's neck like a steel trap. The kid's eyes were wide, darting between the hunter and the weapon inches from his skull. Maddox's voice cut through the air like a rasping saw. "One more step," he growled, "and I'll paint these rocks with his brains." The hunter stood 20 paces away, rifle cradled in his hands, his expression unreadable. A faint breeze tugged at the brim of his hat. His boots were rooted in the dust, his breathing slow, eyes fixed not on Maddox's gun, but on the man's chest, just below the collarbone. His voice came low and calm, like the quiet before a storm. "Let him go, Maddox. You've got nothing left to bargain with." Maddox laughed, though the sound carried a thin edge, as if he were laughing to convince himself. "I've got your conscience right here. You won't risk the boy. Men like you." The rifle cracked. It was so fast, so sudden, that for a heartbeat Maddox didn't move. Then his grip slackened, the revolver slipped from his fingers, and he stumbled back, a dark stain blooming across his shirt where the bullet had found its mark. The boy tumbled free, landing hard in the dust before scrambling to his feet, his breath ragged, disbelief etched across his face. The hunter lowered his rifle, smoke curling from the barrel, his eyes never leaving Maddox. The outlaw leader staggered, trying to form words, but only a wet, gurgling sound escaped before his knees buckled. He collapsed face first into the dirt, the canyon swallowing the dull thud of his fall. The boy looked from the lifeless body to the hunter, chest heaving. For a moment neither moved. Then the hunter tilted his head toward the horizon. "Go." The youth hesitated, searching for something to say, some thanks that would fit the scale of what had just happened, but found nothing. Without another word, he turned and ran, boots kicking up small clouds of dust until his figure vanished behind the canyon's curve. Silence settled again. The hunter remained still for a moment longer, letting the weight of the morning sink into the rocks around him. Then he slung the rifle across his back, stepped over Maddox's body without a glance, and made his way toward the spot where the stolen payroll was stashed. By the time he rode back into town, the sun was climbing high, heat shimmering off the rooftops. The townsfolk froze when they saw him, eyes flicking from his weathered face to the heavy saddlebag draped over his horse. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, swung down, and without ceremony, set the bag on the front step. The weight of the coins and bills inside landed with a solid thump. No speech, no flourish, just the return of what was stolen. The people began to gather, murmuring in disbelief. A man stepped forward, one of the ranchers who'd been robbed, his hat in his hands, eyes bright with gratitude. "Stranger," he said, "we ought to know your name." The hunter looked at him for a long moment, the corners of his mouth twitching in something too small to be called a smile. "Just a hunter," he said, and turned away. He mounted his horse and, with a gentle nudge of his heel, set off down the dirt road leading out of town. The murmurs followed him, voices carrying soft wonder and speculation. Children stood on porches, watching him fade into the heat haze. The horizon was a wide, endless thing, shimmering in the summer air. His figure grew smaller with each stride, until all that remained was the rhythmic thud of hooves. Then even that was gone, swallowed by the distance. Somewhere in the canyon winds, they say you can still hear echoes of that day. The sharp crack of a rifle, the chaos of a gang scattered to the rocks, the impossible shot that split life from death in the width of a breath. They speak of a man who could drop a rabbit before you blinked, who rode alone and asked for nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. And though no one ever knew where he came from or where he went, the story grew, passed in saloons and over campfires, in the hush of twilight when the land feels older than the men who walk it. It became less about a man and more about an idea, that somewhere out there roams a figure who sees through lies, who waits with the patience of stone, and strikes with the speed of lightning. The hunter's name was never known, but his legend took root like mesquite in dry soil, unyielding, enduring. For in a land where mercy was rare and justice rarer still, there was once a man who walked into the jaws of a wolf pack and left nothing but dust in his wake.